If you've been on the internet recently, or more specifically, if you've looked at your bank account recently, you might have noticed a subtle trend, which is that getting rich now feels significantly harder than it used to. Not in a dramatic, cinematic, the system is broken kind of way, but in a quiet, persistent, why does everything keep moving faster than I can keep up kind of way. And the reason for that is simple. Making money is easy, keeping it ahead of everything else is the problem. Now, that sounds like something a finance influencer would say before selling you a course, but unfortunately, it's also mostly true. Because earning money and building wealth are not the same thing anymore. They used to be related, but now they're more like distant acquaintances who occasionally acknowledge each other at events. To understand why getting rich feels harder now, we first need to understand what rich actually means. Because rich used to mean having more money than you needed. Now it means having assets that grow faster than everything else gets more expensive. Which is a very different requirement. Because in the past, if you made more money, you were generally better off. Your income increased, your purchasing power increased, and your savings meant something. Now, your income can increase, your savings can increase, and you can still feel like you're falling behind. Which is confusing, so naturally, people assume they're doing something wrong. And sometimes they are, but mostly the system has just become significantly more complicated. Let's start with the first problem, asset inflation. Now, inflation is something everyone talks about. Prices go up, things get more expensive, you complain about it, and then you continue buying the same things because you have no choice. But there are actually two types of inflation, the kind you notice and the kind that matters. The kind you notice is consumer inflation. Food, rent, gas, services, the things you pay for regularly. The kind that matters is asset inflation. Housing, stocks, land, investments, the things that actually build wealth over time. And here's the issue. Asset prices have been rising faster than incomes for a long time, which means that even if you are earning more, the things that make people wealthy are becoming harder to afford. If housing prices double, but your salary increases by 10%, you are technically doing better, but you are also much further away from owning something that actually builds wealth. So you work harder, earn more, save more, and still feel like you're not progressing, which is not very motivating. Now, you might think, okay, I'll just invest, and that is technically the correct answer, except for one small detail. Everyone else is also investing, and they started earlier and they have more capital, which means they benefit more from the same growth. This is one of the most important parts of modern wealth dynamics. Money makes money, but more money makes more money faster, which means once a gap exists, it tends to widen over time. Not because anyone is doing anything wrong, but because that's how compounding works. If two people invest the same percentage of their income, but one starts with a larger base, they will never be at the same place. The math simply does not allow it, and the gap between them grows every year, quietly without anyone noticing, until it becomes impossible to ignore. The second problem is cost of living, because while assets are getting more expensive, so is everything else. Rent goes up, food goes up, transportation goes up, insurance goes up, and subscriptions go up. Everything quietly increases just enough that you notice, but not enough that you immediately understand how much it's affecting you. And the problem is not just that things are more expensive, it's that they are consistently more expensive. Which means your baseline cost of existing keeps rising, and that reduces how much you can save, and saving is what allows you to invest, and investing is what allows you to build wealth. So if your ability to save is constantly being reduced, your ability to get ahead is also being reduced, even if your income is increasing. Now add lifestyle expectations into this, because modern life has more effectively required expenses than before. Internet, phones, transportation, and convenience services are things that aren't technically necessary but practically unavoidable if you want to function normally in a modern economy. This shift in the minimum cost of participation means that even disciplined budgeting faces more competition for every dollar earned. Which means your spending is not just increasing because of inflation, it's increasing because the minimum cost of participation has changed. So even if you are disciplined, even if you budget carefully, there are simply more things competing for your money than there were 20 years ago.
The third problem is wages, because while costs and assets have been increasing rapidly, wages have not always kept up at the same pace. In some industries they have, and others not so much. And even when wages increase, they often lag behind the things that matter most, which creates a delay.
You get a raise, but by the time you adjust, everything else has already become more expensive. You feel like you're standing still or moving forward very slowly while everything around you is accelerating. Now, combine that with the global job market, because competition is no longer local. You are not just competing with people in your city, you're competing with people across your country, and increasingly with people in other countries, particularly for remote and digital roles. This affects wages, opportunities, and job stability. And when job stability decreases, people become more cautious, saving less aggressively and investing less confidently. They prioritize short-term security over long-term growth, which makes it even harder to build wealth over time.
Fourth problem is time and how it has changed. Building wealth takes time, which has always been true, but time has become more fragmented. People change jobs more often, industries shift faster, and skills become outdated more quickly, which means long-term planning becomes harder.
You can't just pick a path and follow it for 30 years anymore. You have to constantly adjust, retrain, and reposition. And every adjustment comes with uncertainty. And uncertainty makes people hesitant, and hesitation slows compounding. There is also the attention problem. The modern information environment makes it very easy to be aware of financial opportunities and very hard to act on them consistently. There is always a new strategy, a new asset class, a new approach that someone online claims is the real way to build wealth. And while some of that information is useful, a lot of it creates noise, and second guessing leads to inaction. And inaction is the most expensive financial decision most people make, because every year you delay investing is a year of compounding you cannot recover. Now let's talk about a fifth problem that people rarely name directly: the knowledge gap. Building wealth in the modern economy requires a level of financial literacy that was simply not necessary in previous generations. You need to understand how markets work, how tax structures affect investment returns, how inflation interacts with different asset classes, and how to evaluate risk in an environment where the options are genuinely overwhelming. Previously, the path was simpler: get a stable job, buy a house, save in a pension, retire. Each step was clearly defined and socially reinforced. You did not need to understand the mechanics behind it, you just followed the script. That script no longer works as reliably as it did. The pension system has largely shifted to individual contribution models, which means the responsibility for understanding investment decisions has moved from institutions to individuals. The housing market in many cities has become so expensive relative to income that it no longer functions as a reliable wealth-building tool it once was. And the job market is no longer stable enough to treat as a guaranteed foundation. So now, individuals are expected to make sophisticated financial decisions with limited training in a complex environment while managing full-time jobs and the general weight of existing. And they are supposed to do this correctly, consistently, over decades, which is a significant amount to ask. And when people get it wrong or simply do not know enough to get it right, the cost compounds over time in the same way that good decisions do, just in the opposite direction. Now here's where things get interesting, because even with all these challenges, people are still becoming wealthy, just not in the same way. Wealth is still being created, but it's being created in different places: technology, finance, scalable businesses, assets that can grow rapidly. Which means the opportunity still exists, but it's less evenly distributed and harder to access because the barriers to entry are not always obvious. Sometimes they are financial, sometimes they are educational, sometimes they are informational, and sometimes they are just timing, which is the most frustrating one, because it's the one you can't control. Now let's talk about the psychological part, because this is where things feel worse than they actually are. You are constantly exposed to people who appear to be successful on social media, in news, and content, which creates the impression that everyone else is doing better even when they aren't. And that comparison changes your perception because you are no longer comparing yourself to your immediate environment. You are comparing yourself to a global highlight reel of people at their best moments, with their best results presented without context. Which is not realistic, but still affects how you feel, and how you feel affects how you make decisions. If you constantly feel behind, you are more likely to take on excessive risk to catch up or to give up entirely because it seems impossible. Neither of those is a good financial strategy, and both are driven by perception rather than reality. There's also the visibility problem. Wealth used to be relatively private. You knew roughly how your neighbors and colleagues were doing, and that was the extent of your comparison set. Now you have access to the financial lives, or the curated version of them, of millions of people. And people online tend to share the good news: the investment that paid off, the business that grew, and the property that doubled in value. They do not share the failed attempts, the lucky timing, the inherited capital, or the decade of boring consistency that preceded the moment they decided to post about it. So the sample you are comparing yourself to is not representative. It is selected for success. And comparing yourself to a non-representative sample of success produces a predictably distorted sense of where you stand, which makes the whole thing feel harder than it might actually be for someone with a realistic view of what building wealth looks like over time. So now you're dealing with rising asset prices, rising costs, stagnant relative wages, increased competition, fragmented time, and constant comparison, which creates a compounding sense that getting rich is harder, and in many structural ways, it is. But not for the reasons people usually think. It's not just about effort or discipline or intelligence, it's about structure. The system has changed, the rules are different, the pace is faster, and the margin for error is smaller. Now here's the part where things sound slightly optimistic, because this video needs to end somewhere. While it is harder in some ways, it's also more accessible in others. Information is available in ways it never was before. Investing tools are accessible to people who previously had no entry point. New industries are constantly emerging, which means the path is not closed, it's just less straightforward and requires more active navigation than it used to. There is no single path anymore. There are multiple paths. Some are traditional, some are unconventional, some are stable, some are risky, and figuring out which one works for you is part of the process, which is both empowering and exhausting, often at the same time. Making money is easy. Keeping it ahead of everything else is the problem, because it's not just about earning, it's about growing and protecting and positioning, which requires a different mindset. Because if you only focus on income, you will always feel like you are chasing something. But if you focus on assets, you start to build something. And that distinction, while it sounds simple, changes almost everything about how you approach the question. Does this mean everyone can get rich? No. Does it mean no one can? Also no. It means the environment is more complex, and complexity requires awareness and strategy, and sometimes a bit of luck, and occasionally just being in the right place at a moment when a particular asset or industry happened to take off, which is not a satisfying answer, but it is an accurate one, and accurate is more useful than motivating, even if it feels worse in the moment. So why does getting rich feel harder now? Because everything that contributes to wealth is moving faster than most people can comfortably keep up with. Assets rise quickly, costs rise steadily, opportunities shift constantly, information is overwhelming, and the gap between people who started early and people who are starting now is large enough to feel discouraging, even when it is not overmountable. Which creates friction, and friction slows progress, but it does not stop it, because despite all of this, progress is still possible, just not as simple as it used to be, and definitely not as predictable. So the next time you feel like you are doing everything right but still not getting ahead, you are probably not imagining it, because the ground is actually moving. Asset prices are rising faster than wages, costs are compressing savings, and the knowledge required to navigate the system is higher than it has ever been. And a psychological environment makes all of it feel more urgent and more personal than it probably should. But none of that means it's impossible. It means it requires more deliberate effort than it once did, applied in the right direction over a longer timeline than most people are comfortable with, which is not the version of the answer that gets clicks, but it is the version that is actually true. The system is not broken, but it's just very efficient at doing something other than making you wealthy. Understanding that distinction between a system that is failing and a system that is working exactly as designed but not for you is actually the most useful place to start. Because once you see it clearly, you can stop trying to fix the wrong thing and start working with what the system actually rewards. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, consider subscribing. Every week we explain the systems shaping money, work, and everyday life, clearly, without jargon, and without pretending any of it is simpler than it is. Subscribe below. See you in the next one. Start by checking for any forgotten subscriptions or hidden costs, because every dollar saved is a dollar that can be invested.